Number 1.
In February 1983, at the height of the Troubles, Ireland faced a truly mysterious crime that remains virtually unsolved. Shergar, a beloved thoroughbred racehorse worth over $15 million, was kidnapped from his stable in County Kildare by a gang of machine gun-wielding men in balaclavas. After failed attempts to demand money for the stallion, gentle Shergar was brutally killed and his body was never found. The most famous and valuable racehorse in the world, Shergar had won the 1981 Epsom Derby by 10 lengths, which is the longest winning margin in the race's 202-year history. Following this triumph, he had 4 more major Derby wins and was named European Horse of the Year. When he retired after that first season, racehorse owners paid up to $120,000 for shares in his services, impregnating mares eager to have young horses from his bloodline to train for races. The stallion had a white blaze mark on his face, 4 white sarks, and a distinctive racing style of running with his tongue hanging out. He was gentle, calm and kind. On the cold, muggy evening of February 8, 1983, Shergar was kidnapped by a gang of men in balaclavas, thought to be part of the IRA. The bay colt was owned by the Aga Khan, the billionaire spiritual leader to 15 million Ismaili Muslims. When he was returned to Ireland after her first winning season, he was syndicated for $15 million between 34 people. Each share was worth around $382,000, 6 of which were kept by the Aga Khan. Shergar was just 5 years old when he was snatched in the middle of the night from the Ballimony Stud and Company. Kildare. He had been preparing for his second season as a breeding stallion, the BBC said. It was shortly after 8 p.m. when the son of Jim Fitzgerald, Shergar's head groom that lived at the stud, heard a knock at the door. He opened it to find 2 men wearing balaclavas wielding guns. One of them said, "We have come for Shergar. We want $3 million for him." Jim Fitzgerald, a father of 6, was forced at gunpoint to Shergar's stable, where they were joined by 6 more masked gunmen. He loaded Shergar into the horsebox the men had brought with them. Fitzgerald was then forced into their car at gunpoint. Among others, one reason the investigation was so difficult for authorities was because the kidnappers had chosen the day before Ireland's Big Goffs racehorse sale to abduct Shergar, when many horseboxes were being driven across all of Ireland's roads, thereby making it hard to differentiate him. "I can still remember that night in that car with them lads. All sorts of thoughts were racing through my head about what they might do to me. One of them, with the revolver, was very aggressive," Mr. Fitzgerald told the Telegraph about his ride in the kidnapper's car. After driving him around for 3 hours, the kidnappers dumped Fitzgerald out of the car. He found his way to a telephone and rang his brother. This phone call led to a series of phone calls between Shergar's shareholders, his vet, racing associates and several Irish ministers. This process is referred to as a caricature of police bungling, as the actual police weren't notified until 8 hours after Shergar was taken, and the men were long gone from the area. Using coded phrases, the kidnappers soon began negotiations with a representative of the Aga Khan over the telephone, but made sure to hang up before 90 seconds passed so that authorities couldn't track their location. Collectively, it had been decided not to pay the ransom because they figured if they had, every racehorse in the world would be in danger, as many of them were worth over £1 million, $1.5 million, and Ireland had lacked adequate security. The hunt for Shergar created a huge media storm. Everyone in the UK and Ireland were hell-bent on getting him back, and the Dublin police had offered an over $150,000 reward for his return. The kidnappers had agreed to negotiate with a man named Derek Thompson, who had worked for ITV's racing team. He flew to Belfast to negotiate at the Europa Hotel. He said the scene that greeted him at Belfast Airport was unreal. It was like being a film star. There were cameras all around. About 100 cameramen and journalists were in or outside the Europa Hotel as Thompson and his co-negotiators arrived. The men never reached an agreement. Thompson received a phone call the next day from the kidnappers. They said, "The horse has had an accident. He's dead." He then hung up. There are several ideas pertaining to what happened to Shergar. One idea is that the horse did have some sort of accident while in a frenzy, and the men killed him because they couldn't handle his crazed manner. Senior IRA leader Kevin Mallon is thought to be the man who devised the plot. A convicted killer from Company. Tyrone, he eventually became part of IRA folklore after shooting his way out of one prison and being lifted by helicopter from another. What has been discovered almost definitively, according to a close course, was that 2 handlers, one clutching a machine gun, went into the remote stable where the horse was being held and opened fire. A former IRA member told the Sunday Telegraph. Shergar was machine gunned to death. There was blood everywhere and the horse even slipped on his own blood. There was lots of cussing and swearing because the horse wouldn't die. It was a very bloody death. It was several minutes before Shergar bled to death. It is also widely believed his kidnappers buried him in a bog in company. Leitrim, though some think they dumped him into the Sea of Ireland's south coast. Shergar's former jockey Walter Swinburne, who rode Shergar at his famous race, was distressed by the findings. No horse deserves an ending like that, let alone one as special as Shergar. Shergar's body was never found, and the case remains a mystery. The IRA has never officially claimed responsibility for stealing the beloved horse. The incident has inspired several books, documentaries, and a film starring Mickey Rourke.
Number 2.
When Jayme Closs, 13, vanished on the night that her parents were fatally shot in their rural home, scores of law enforcement officials converged on western Wisconsin. Hundreds of tips flowed in. Family members issued tearful pleas. But in the end, it was Jayme herself who broke the case. She emerged along a wooded road on Thursday afternoon about an hour from her home, her hair matted and wearing ill-fitting shoes, and asked for help from a passing stranger who was out walking a dog. The middle schooler, whose smiling photo had appeared on signs and leaflets all over the state, had escaped from a captor who had been holding her for months, the authorities said, bringing shock, relief, and a sudden end to a mystery that had shaken this icy pine-lined region of Wisconsin. Jayme is the hero in this case, Kris Fitzgerald, the sheriff of Barron County, said. By Friday morning, officials announced that they were holding a local man, Jake T. Patterson, 21, pending formal charges of kidnapping and murder. Jayme had directed the authorities to him, they said, by providing a description of his car. He was found in his car, apparently out searching for Jayme not long after Jayme appeared along the road near Gordon, about 65 miles north of Barron, where the Closs family had lived. But the discovery of Jayme, who went home with an aunt on Friday after being examined in a hospital, and the arrest of Mr. Patterson, who had no known criminal record in Wisconsin, left many unanswered questions. What was the motive for the double killings and the kidnapping? And how had Jayme been held for months in a home without anyone in the area noticing? Of the many questions people were asking, Sheriff Fitzgerald said, "Believe me, so are we." Sheriff Fitzgerald said the authorities believed that Jayme had been targeted by her kidnapper, but that they so far knew of no connection or contact between Mr. Patterson and the Closs family. Mr. Patterson had once worked at the same turkey plant that Jayme's parents, James and Denise Closs, worked at for years before their deaths. But Mr. Patterson's stint there 3 years ago had lasted a day, officials said, and there was no hint of any contact with the Closses or their daughter. "We're very happy that she is alive," Jayme's uncle, Jeff Closs, said in a text message. Just when the family started to give up hope, Mr. Closs said, "We got the greatest news ever." On Friday, Jayme's aunt Jennifer Smith shared a selfie with Jayme, who was holding her dog, Molly, and smiling. Jayme had been missing since October 15, when the authorities found her parents dead in their home. The front door was open, and Jayme was gone. The double killing of the Closses, a quiet couple, and the disappearance of their daughter stunned Barron, a town of just over 3,400. A manhunt drew more than 2,100 tips and thousands of volunteers. All over town, shops and homes hung green ribbons bearing the words "Find Jayme Closs." The local police force of 78 swelled as a corps of 200 federal, state and local officers joined a hunt that went on day and night. Her disappearance also drew national attention, and her name topped the FBI's missing persons list as the reward for her recovery grew to $50,000. On Friday, signs that read "Welcome Home Jayme" appeared on many stores along Highway 8 through Barron gas stations, churches, a collision center, a farm equipment supplier, the Dairy Queen. The news spread quickly, and even those who did not know the teenager said they were overcome. "I started shaking," said Sharon Masek, 65, a manager at a sand and gravel supplier in Barron. "We had been wishing for this for so long." Next door to the Closses' home, Joan Smreeker, a retiree who had heard gunshots on the night that the Closses were killed, said she could end her daily habit of staring out at the neighbor's property and wondering where Jayme was. "Up until yesterday," Ms. Smreeker said, "I would go out in the kitchen and I'd look out that kitchen window, and it was like, God, I wish I knew if you were out there. If you can't come back, let us know where you're at." But even with this news, she said, closure would be hard to come by. Ms. Smreeker cried as she spoke. "It's like, where do you begin the end?" she said. Near Gordon, a town that had not known that it had any connection to the case, residents were shaken as they learned that Jayme, the missing girl they had read about, had been among them all along. The home where the authorities said she had been held was in a wooded cul-de-sac known as Eau Claire Acres. Some residents said the beloved seclusion of this part of northwestern Wisconsin, known for its lakeside cabins and ATV trails, was also probably what kept Jayme out of sight for so long. "What bothers me the most is that we didn't know," said Dolly McNamara, 66, who owns a nearby bar. "We watch over each other's cabins when they're gone. We see tracks going to someone's cabin that we know is not there, we go and check. Everyone keeps an eye out," she said. "I guess it's just never enough." Residents said they were unaware of Mr. Patterson, they had never met or seen him, many said, even though the authorities said he had lived in the area for years. Mr. Patterson, who was unemployed, graduated from the Northwood School District in nearby Minong, Wisconsin, in May 2015, according to a school official, Gene Sarum. "He was a quiet but good student," Ms. Sarum said. "He had been a member of the Quiz Bowl team. We never locked the door up here, and we did lock the door last night," said Jill Logg, 63, a teacher who has a cabin in the area. "The restlessness last night was, how could he have acted alone?" A neighbor, Daphne Ronning, told the Chicago Sun-Times that Mr. Patterson and a brother grew up in the house that the authorities say Jayme was held in, and that at some point their parents had moved out, but the two sons continued to live in the home. "We had some problems with them when they were teenagers, we caught them siphoning gas," Ms. Ronning said. The authorities have said they do not have any additional suspects in the kidnapping or killings beyond Jake Patterson, who is expected to face formal charges on Monday. No one from Mr. Patterson's immediate or extended family could be reached. It was not known if he had been appointed a lawyer. On Thursday afternoon, Jean Nutter, a social worker near Gordon, had been out walking her dog when Jayme suddenly approached her. Ms. Nutter brought the girl to the nearby home of Kristen and Peter Kacinskas, who told the Minneapolis Star-Tribune that Ms. Nutter had said, "This is Jayme Closs. Call 911. As they waited for the authorities to arrive, the family offered Jayme food and water and introduced her to their puppy. The couple said Jayme told them she did not know where she was, the newspaper reported. "It was like I was seeing a ghost," Peter Kacinskas told the Star-Tribune. "It was scary and awesome at the same time. My jaw just went to the floor."
Number 3.
In 1923, more than 600 people vanished from the village of Hoer, Verde, Brazil, and still to this day there is no explanation for the mystery. Travelers who cut through the town discovered all the buildings, including the well-built homes, were abandoned. There were no signs of an ambush or kidnapping, just creepily a school blackboard which had "There is no salvation" written in chalk. A manhunt began for the villagers, and one popular theory was all the villagers fled due to the political climate in Brazil, and they feared conflict with guerrillas. Despite this theory being believable, nobody can understand how 600 people could not be found inhabiting somewhere else. Conspiracy theorists have blamed alien abduction, but again it's another mystery that may never be explained. The mysterious legend of Hoer Verde, the town with 600 inhabitants that vanished, is certainly confusing and troubling. The case will cause you to ask questions like how can anything like that ever happen with absolutely no evidence to suggest anything unusual had happened. Like so many legends from the area, information on Hoer Verde is difficult to track down. But what information is accessible is not only disturbing but incredibly perplexing. As visitors to the village entered the small town, they were immediately struck by how dead everything was. Unlike other villages of 600, no one was walking through the streets. Hanging signs waved in the gentle wind creaked noisily, juxtaposed with the uneasy footsteps and uneasy and subdued whispers of those passing through. As they passed by local houses and looked in the windows, it was evident immediately that something wasn't right. No one was anywhere to be seen. The police were called, and investigators descended on the town to look through the village. As they came to the town's school, they found a gun, which they took to be forensically examined. And then the investigators looked to the blackboard on which the words, "There is no salvation," were written. After a cursory examination, they realized that it had been fired the day before, but by whom they were unsure. A manhunt ensued for the 600 villagers in the small town. Despite this, no trace of any of the locals was ever unearthed. To date, it is considered an unsolved mystery. As newspaper reports of the town's disappearance reached the West, it was considered a curiosity, but with the shifting political climate of Brazil in 1923, it was considered possible that the town had evacuated to avoid conflict with guerrillas. Arthur da Silva Bernardes had been elected the year before and faced a political siege throughout his term. But political evacuations are by no means unheard of. And those who leave a village abandoned always turn up elsewhere. If they had simply left the town, where did they go? Others contend that it's possible the town was attacked. This too leaves a perplexing mystery. Another mysterious element is the original language of the phrase "there is no salvation." Though the phrase has been largely translated into English, the phrase holds little significance in English or Portuguese. However, if the words had been "illic est haud salus" in Latin or some variation of it, this could have been related to the phrase "extra ecclesiam nulla salus," which is a Catholic phrase meaning outside the church there is no salvation. If this was the case in a largely Catholic area, the lesson could have been a religious lesson which was interrupted by some unknown force, but with no specific significance itself. Many references to this story exist, but most seem to be derived from a simple article translated from Russian. This lack of information is one of the more perplexing elements of the Hoer Verde case.
Number 4.
On April 1, 2014, Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon left their host family's home to take the family's dog on a walk through the scenic forests around the Beru volcano in Bakwit, Panama. Kremers and Froon were students from Amersfoort in the Netherlands. They had spent 6 months planning their trip to Panama, which was supposed to serve as part vacation, part service trip. They planned on spending some time hiking and touring, while also volunteering with local children, teaching arts and crafts, and learning Spanish. The two women had been hiking around the Panamanian jungle for the past 2 weeks as part of a backpacking mission trip and intended to stay for the next 4 weeks with their host family to volunteer at a local school. However, after they waved goodbye to their family at 11 a.m. on April 1, they were never seen again. The women had written a Facebook post in which they wrote about their intentions to tour the local village. They also wrote that they had had brunch with 2 fellow Dutchmen before embarking on their hike. On the night of April 1, the host family noticed something was wrong. Their dog had returned, safe and sound, but alone the girls were nowhere to be found. The host family searched the area around their home but decided to wait until morning to alert the authorities. On April 2, Kremers and Froon missed an appointment with a local tour guide who was supposed to take them on a private walking tour of Bakwit, which prompted the host family to alert authorities. The next morning an aerial search of the forest was conducted, as well as a foot search of the village and the lightly wooded areas by locals. By April 6, the two women were still missing. Fearing the worst, the Kremers and Froon families flew to Panama, bringing with them detectives from the Netherlands. Along with local police and dog units, they searched the forests for 10 days. Days turned into weeks, and after 10 weeks there had still not been any sign of Kremers or Froon. Then, as police were slowing their search efforts, a local woman turned in a blue backpack, claiming to have found it in a rice paddy along the banks of the river. Inside the backpack were 2 pairs of sunglasses, $83 in cash, Froon's passport, a water bottle, and 2 bras. Also inside, most importantly, was Froon's camera and both of the women's cell phones. Police immediately investigated the camera and phones and came up with disturbing evidence. The phones had remained in service for almost 10 days after the women disappeared. Over just 4 days, 77 separate attempts had been made to call the police, both via 112, the emergency number in the Netherlands, and 911, the emergency number in Panama. Using the call logs, police were able to come up with an outline of the time the girls spent missing in the forests. The first 2 emergency calls had been just hours after Kremers and Froon had begun their hike to the 112 emergency number. Due to the dense jungle, neither of the attempts went through. In fact, out of all 77 calls, only 1 managed to make contact but broke up after just 2 seconds. Police also discovered that on April 6, several unsuccessful attempts were made to unlock Kremers' phone with an incorrect PIN number. It never received the correct number again. By April 11, both phones were dead. Though the call log was disturbing, it was nothing compared to the camera. The first photos on the camera were taken the morning of April 1, when the women had left for their hike. The photos showed them on a trail near the Continental Divide, though nothing about them led police to become suspicious. However, the second set of photos was worrisome. Taken in the dead of night, between the hours of 1 and 4 a.m. on April 8, the photos showed the girls' belongings spread out on rocks, plastic bags and candy wrappers, oddly piled mounds of dirt, a mirror, and most worrisome, the back of Kremers' head with blood leaking from her temple. After investigating the area where the backpack had been found, police uncovered Kremers' clothing, neatly folded along the edge of the river. 2 months later, in the same area, a pelvic bone and a foot, still inside a boot, were found. Soon after that, the bones of both women were discovered. Lisanne Froon's bones looked as if they had decomposed naturally, as there were still bits of flesh attached to them. Kremers' bones were stark white and looked as if they had been bleached. Police questioned the locals, tour guides, and other hikers who had been in the area at the time, but nothing besides the photos and call logs provided them with any evidence as to what had happened. There wasn't even enough evidence to determine the cause of death. To this day, the disappearance and deaths of Kris Kremers and Lisanne Froon remain a harrowing mystery.
Number 5.
When Berlin physician Friedrich Ritter came to the island of Florina in the Galapagos Islands in 1929 with his lover Dorstrauch, it was neither developed nor inhabited. A small island around 80 kilometers 50 mi from Santa Cruz, the nearest neighboring island with even any suggestion of a populace, Florina would be their paradise. Shortly afterward, the Whitners, Heinz, Margaret, and their teenage son also moved to the island. However, the expected paradise of Ritter and Strauch as well as the Whitners was about to take a turn for the worst with the arrival of Baroness Eloise Wehrborn de Wagner Bosquet in 1931. She was accompanied by Robert Philipson, one of her lovers, Rudolf Lorenz, another alleged lover, and an Ecuadorian named Manuel Valdivieso. Wagner Bosquet had managed to secure a patch of land through a contact in the Ecuador government. The land, however, contained a water spring that the Whitmers had been using. When the island was hit by a drought, things began to turn nasty. Ritter wasn't happy about more people encroaching on their ideal island in the sun, and the Whitmers blamed Wagner Bosquet and her entourage for the drought and the limiting of their use of the spring. Wagner Bosquet herself was said to play her lovers off against each other. In short, she hadn't exactly made friends fast on the island. On March 17, 1934, Wagner Bosquet allegedly arrived at the Whitmers' house and stated that she and Philipson were leaving the island on a yacht that was destined for Tahiti. It belonged to friends who had arrived that day, at least that was the story Margaret Whitmer told. Neither Wagner Bosquet nor Philipson were ever seen again. No one else, it seemed, could recall a yacht or any other boat arriving on the island that day. Wagner Bosquet had also left practically all of her things behind, supposedly in the care of Lorenz. Again, that was the story that Margaret told. Following her disappearance, other suspicious activity unfolded on the once magical island. Ritter himself died, allegedly from food poisoning from eating infected chicken. This is particularly strange, as Ritter was a vegetarian. Lorenz had also begun to act nervous and desperate to get off the island. He paid a Norwegian fisherman to help him get to Santa Cruz. However, they, too, did not make their destination. Instead, their bodies were both discovered on the island of Marchena, almost mummified. Strauch returned to Germany and insisted in a book she wrote that Lorenz had killed Wagner Bosquet and Philipson, possibly out of jealousy. However, it appears that Margaret Whitmer may have been involved, directly or indirectly, in the lovers' deaths and quite possibly in those of Ritter and Lorenz as well. The Galapagos Affair. Satan Came to Eden has much new footage of the islands as well, along with fascinating clippings of vintage news items and feature stories from German, American and Ecuadorian newspapers. There are even illustrations from a trashy men's magazine that stretches the facts into a lurid tale of an erotic queen and her sex slaves in a South American jungle. The documentary plays like a suspense story. A lineup of stars Kate Blanchett, Sebastian Koch, Thomas Kretschmann, Diane Kruger and Connie Nielsen recites the passages from the diaries of the settlers, making the story seem even more personal. The show even has a satisfying ending because we feel we learn enough about the settlers to formulate our own theories of who killed whom.
Number 6.
While most accounts can't agree on how many events in history he haunted, some say he was at the wedding at Cana, Jesus plus water equals wine, others that he was present at the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD. Most will agree that in the 1600s, the Comte was an alchemist, and this is where he becomes more well known. Now, if you are familiar with Harry Potter, you might have heard the term called the Philosopher's Stone, which was one of the main goals of alchemy. The elusive search for immortality, and something it is thought that the Comte achieved. Saint Germain was out in high society Europe in 1742. He was described as vastly knowledgeable in the sciences and history, well-spoken in over 6 languages, including French, German, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian and English, along with familiarity in Chinese, Latin, Arabic, Ancient Greek and even Sanskrit. The first record of his suspected immortality was at a party at the manor of Madame de Pompadour, then mistress of King Louis XV of France. The year was 1760, and a confused Countess von Gregory approached the man, thinking it was the son of the man she knew in 1710, whom she knew to be the Count de Saint-Germain also. On approach she discovered it was the same man who didn't seem to have aged a day in the 50 years that had passed. It is noted that the Comte didn't even deny that it was him or play himself off as the son. It is even said that he joked with the Countess that he was indeed over 100 years old. 40 more years, the Countess Saint-Germain was said to travel throughout Europe. Never aging and continuously marveling the elite of Europe with his abilities, like his genius on the violin, or his painting skills, his deep wallets, his knowledge of medicine, and the fact that he always dined with his peers but never ate. It is said that he only drank wine, which of course he was said to be a connoisseur. Voltaire, the 18th-century philosopher, described Saint-Germain as a man who never dies and who knows everything. The supposed final account of the Comte was when he traveled to Hamburg, Germany, and befriended Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel. Saint-Germain became a trusted confidant of the prince and lived as a guest in the castle at Eckernford. This is where it was rumored that he finally died. The only thing that accounts for his death though is a local record that states Count Saint-Germain deceased, February 27, 1784. The Comtesse d'Adhemer claims that the Count was there to witness the beheading of Marie Antoinette October 16, 1793. He would have been close to 100 years old if Google is correct in their estimated year of birth at 1710. Yet, even though the records of his death were found, the Count was continued to be seen all over Europe as soon as a year after his supposed death by none other than Anton Mesmer, the man who pioneered the art of hypnotism, said to be taught to him by Saint-Germain. Then records indicate Saint-Germain was chosen as a representative for the Freemasons at a convention. Story after story of him appears in written records, and never the man looks older than 45. The Comtesse d'Adhemer even wrote, "I have seen Saint-Germain again, each time to my amazement. I saw him when the Queen was murdered, on the 18th of Brumaire, on the day following the death of the Duc d'Enghien, in January 1815, and on the eve of the murder of the Duc de Berry." The Comtesse wrote this account in 1820, by all accounts Saint-Germain would. In the year is 1902, and a man going by Jacques Saint-Germain moves into the prestigious building at the corner of Ursulines and Royal. It is said that he has immigrated from the south of France and a descendant of the Count Saint-Germain. His first introduction into New Orleans society was a party he threw, where he invited all the elite of New Orleans, dignitaries and politicians. Fed them from a catered menu on the finest china and silverware, yet didn't himself eat a bite. All he did was drink what guests believed to be red wine. This supposedly offended New Orleans polite society, and Jacques, while immensely rich, never seemed to fit in. He was described as charming, highly intelligent and a master of languages and art, but the company he kept and the fact that he was known to party a lot, loved Bourbon Street, kept him from being accepted by the elitists. Jacques Saint-Germain didn't come back into attention until the police took notice of him. Jacques had picked up a woman in a local pub and taken her back to his home. The young woman later finds herself at the police station with a tale that sounds right out of a fantasy novel. She said that Saint-Germain came at her with alarming speed and strength when she leaned over to inspect some beautiful items on his mantle. With that speed and strength in full use, he pressed her against a mantle and began biting her viciously on her neck. As luck would have it, at that exact moment a few of Jacques' more rowdy friends began banging at his door to lure him out for a drink. The pounding distracted Jacques enough for the woman to break away, but instead of trying to make it past Jacques, she decides to throw herself through the second-story window and over the balcony that surrounds the property to the bricked street below, thus resulting in her legs breaking in a few places. Her desperate screams drew the police, and they took her to the hospital and took her statement. Jacques, when questioned that night, stated only that she was drunk and decided to jump. Police asked if Jacques could come down to the station in the morning to give a formal statement. Jacques never appears at the police station the next day. When they decide to pay him a visit, they find his house is abandoned and most of his things gone. Police take this as invitation to inspect his home and are confused by what they find. For one, there are blood stains all over tablecloths in the house, and from what they can tell they are from different time periods. Then to top it off, there was absolutely not one piece of food in the house. Not even utensils or plates, just a large collection of wine glasses and wine bottles filled with what police believed to be red wine, yet upon taste, discovered it was a mixture of blood and wine. Comte Saint-Germain and Richard Chanfray, the man who claimed to be the Count in the 1970s. Chanfray appeared on television with his claim and supposedly changed lead into gold. Chanfray committed suicide in Saint-Tropez in 1983. Picture is taken from before its news, and they report that Chanfray faked his suicide and is still alive to this day. Which would be true if he really is the Count. There have been numerous reports, even in present day, that a mysterious figure, sometimes known as Jacques, will often harass tourists and locals, displaying amazing speed or strength. Today New Orleans is known as one of the most violent cities in the US, leading the country in murders per capita. But it doesn't stop there. We are also known for our mysterious disappearances, which are not based in the low-income districts of NOLA, but usually focus on tourists and even visiting celebrities. These crimes give the city a dangerous and almost gothic flair and perpetuate the rumors that it might not be drug dealers that are pushing our crime stats through the roof, but maybe a few vampires, one in particular that goes by Jacques.
Number 7.
The legend of El Dorado has captivated explorers for centuries. And how could it not? The legendary city is said to be made of solid gold. But like all great mysteries, El Dorado demands a heavy price from those who would search for it, as adventurer Perry Fawcett found out in 1925. To be fair, Fawcett didn't believe in a lost city of gold. But he did have a theory that El Dorado wasn't completely a myth. He thought that the story might be based on a real city that existed deep in the Amazon rainforest. For lack of a better name, he called the city Z. And if anyone could find the lost city of Z, it was Fawcett, a famed explorer and surveyor with a half-dozen trips through the Amazon under his belt. He had also served as an artilleryman in the British military, fought in World War I, and worked as a spy in Morocco. Needless to say, Fawcett wasn't the kind of man who shied away from danger. So when he stumbled upon an 18th-century document in the National Library of Brazil written by a Portuguese explorer who spoke of an ancient city deep in the jungle, he knew that he had to find it. To this day, parts of the Amazon are largely unmapped. So, it's easy to imagine how difficult the task of finding a lost city in the middle of it would be in the 1920s. But Fawcett was confident that the good relations he had built up with the tribes living in the Amazon and his experience mapping the region would see him through. However, Percy Fawcett's first attempt to find the city in 1920 was a failure. His pack horse was injured and he was forced to shoot it. He then contracted a dangerous illness deep in the jungle and had to stumble back to civilization racked with fever. But with the financial support of a group of London-based investors, Fawcett set out 5 years later for a second attempt. This time, he brought along his son Jacques and Jacques' best friend, a boy named Raleigh Ramel. Fawcett hoped that by only bringing 2 people with him, he would be able to travel light and slip past any hostile tribes. The trio set out into the rainforest. In April, the party left the Brazilian city of Cuiabá, one of the last outposts of civilization in the Amazon. In late May, Fawcett wrote a letter to his wife from an encampment he had created on his earlier expedition. Fawcett called it Dead Horse Camp as it was the place where he had to shoot his horse. In the letter, he reported that things were going well and assured her that success was close at hand. But it was the last message anyone ever received from Fawcett. Months went by with no news of the expedition. Rescue attempts were mounted, but none turned up any evidence of what happened. It seemed that Percy Fawcett had simply disappeared into the jungle. The best explanation may be that he and his companions were killed by a hostile tribe, as illustrated by the movie about Fawcett's life, The Lost City of Z. Fawcett wrote that he was told repeatedly that the natives of the area were violent toward outsiders. This was the theory of the Kalapo tribe, who have an oral tradition of 3 white men visiting the area where they live. According to the story, the group was an older man and 2 younger men, both of whom were injured. That description certainly fits Fawcett's party. But to this day, no clear evidence of what happened to the group has been discovered. And it seems that Percy Fawcett and his companions were simply victims of the myth of El Dorado.